I'm doing a series on the Indian Act because people are so uninformed. This is from 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. We're going to start on Chapter 2. May 1911, the Indian Act amends Section 46. Municipal companies could expropriate parts of reserves to build roads, railways, public facilities with the approval of the government. This was fucked up. Section 49A gave the government the right to relocate any reserves situated near a town of 8,000 people or more without having to obtain a prior approval of the residences. This is because they shouldn't be so close to civilization. 1913, BC. British Columbia bypasses the Indian Act to convince the Squamish leaders to sell their land and leave. So the male heads of the family were given $11,250. Their belongings were barged elsewhere. Their houses were burnt. The land remains under the control of the Indian Act. 1930, the city of Vancouver claimed 6.2 acres of the reserve for the Burrard Street Bridge. 1934, Department of National Defense gets 4 acres. 1942, Indian Act leases 41.74 acres to the Department of Defense for World War II. World War II is when Indigenous people went to go fight in the war. They lost their status. When they got home, they found out that they had been, civilized. This is how close this is in time frame, by the way. 1947 to 1965, the reserve is broken into pieces and sold. 1977, nations start suing the government. Squamish Nation did not reclaim any land until 2002. It's a small portion. In 1880, Indian agents assigned every Indigenous man a Christian name and often a non-Indigenous surname. Women got a Christian name and then surname of the husband or father. Ignored all of the names that they went by, all of their traditional names. I say they, but I'm also Indigenous. Fun fact, but not fun fact, Indian agents often use their own name. So what they would do is they would go to one reserve and they would be like, oh, you're going to be John Smith, or say John Jacob. I don't know, Jacob, right? And then there would be people in other areas of the country that would have the last name Jacob that were on reserves. And so people would be like, oh, Jacob from over there, are you related to Jacob from over there? And it'd be like, no, but we actually probably had the same Indian agent, because this guy, they were only men, would go from reserve to reserve and give people his name as their last name. These Indian agents, though. So they wanted Indigenous people to become civilized. And one of the ways that they were wanting them to become civilized was by farming. That's how they thought that you would be a good person, or a civilized person. But they kept putting reserve land on places that were poor, for growing crops, as an excuse to dwindle down the amount of reserve land. So oh, we need you guys to farm. And they would try and farm and the land would be crap for farming and it didn't have the right nutrients in the soil. They'd be like, you guys aren't good at farming, so you don't need this much land. And they use that as a way to take away land. And then the people who were good at farming started making white people upset, right? Because then they were in competition with Indigenous people. So the white people, the European people, complained. So what they did was these Indian agents had to give them permits to sell their crops. Yeah. So if you were good at it, you had to get permits, and a lot of times they wouldn't get permits. You weren't allowed, if you were an Indigenous person, you weren't allowed to gift people crops. You weren't allowed to give it away. You weren't allowed to sell it unless you got permission. And obviously they didn't do that a lot. This was used as a way to keep people poor. Then what ended up happening is Indigenous people are very big about community. So what would happen was they were poor. They couldn't afford a lot, but they would be like, you know what? All of us, we'll get together. We'll work on this farm. And we will do this for each other, and we'll pool our money to buy equipment to farm. The government went, we don't want them doing that. So then they had to get permission from their Indian agent to buy equipment. They had to go to the government and say, I would like to buy this equipment. And they had to buy it themselves. They couldn't crowdfund, essentially. They couldn't use the community. That was frowned upon. That was uncivilized, because they believed that civilized people should be individualistic and self-reliant. From 1886 to 1892, they didn't include cattle when it came to these permits. It was only for farming, because Britain needed Canadian cattle. But then in 1892, Britain said, we don't need any more cattle. And they said, okay, now you need permits. You'd be like, oh, why does this matter? And it matters because in 1951, the permit system extended to apply to all Indians, but they gradually didn't enforce it. And do you know what was repealed? Do you know when it got taken away? 2014. So yeah, 2014. Just a reminder, what government was that? Because it wasn't conservative. Follow for more. I'm going to keep doing this.